welcome to FOBtv, the future of business. I'm Kevin Benedict. I'm a futurist and partner here at TCS. I want to welcome each of you to the program. I'm really excited to introduce my guest today, Steve Hamm. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Very good to be here.
So now this is an impressive bio I'm going to give here. So hold your seats. Here it comes. He is a Pulitzer-nominated author, a freelance writer and documentary filmmaker based in New Haven, Connecticut. He has been writing and editing articles and books about the tech industry since 1989. I just graduated.
You're dating me. Yeah, right. Right.
He became the tech editor for the San Jose Mercury News, which I've read a lot of. He later worked for PC Week, Business Week, IBM, and Yale University. He has authored or co-authored 6 different books, including one we'll talk about today, The Pivot, Addressing Global Problems Through Local Action in Smart Machines. His most recent documentary film, Oyster Heaven, will be broadcast on Connecticut Public TV in June.
Yep.
Congratulations on that. That's awesome.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
So before we jump into everything, Steve, you were like the ultimate technology geek for a lot of your career, it looks like, and you're doing a lot of purposeful projects in this season of your career.
Sure.
How'd that transition happen?
You know, I've been mainly a writer most of my life. That's the kind of storytelling I've done. And but you know, it's funny. I got into documentaries. Actually, the beginning was back in the probably in the early days of the internet and internet news. I worked for PC Week, and we put out one of the first, online news publications. I think it was called PC Week, and then ZDNet. And almost immediately, you're out there, on the internet, and you want to make films. Now, of course, the bandwidth was sucked in those days, but whenever we could, we put videos up. And then when I was at Business Week, we did a lot more with that. We tried to have a little bit of a video storytelling. And then IBM, a bit more, and I learned more. Started learning how to edit. I got my first MacBook Pro for editing. So, I mean, this is really, and then I went freelance in 2016 and live in a town, New Haven. It's a city with tremendous resources and assets, both human and physical, but also tremendous problems. So with a friend of mine, we started making what we call community building films, which are about the big issues. We did immigration, we did policing, we did opioids, and then most recently we've actually made 2 films about oystering. One a 30-minute film for TV, and then one a feature film for festivals. So we've, I guess, even though I don't get paid for the documentaries, for my full-length documentaries, I guess we're professional now,
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. In the course of your career, you've had a chance to interview a lot of kind of industry luminaries. You've been able to interview Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, Larry Ellison, and on and on and on.
Steve Jobs,
man.
Yeah.
So which of those interviews that you participated in did you learn the most? You left thinking, man, I just spent time with a sage.
Yeah. Well, those captains of industry that we just listed, they're all very impressive people. I did interview the Dalai Lama. He's very wise.
Yes.
But I would say among the business leaders who are most impressive, the one I'm going to mention is Marc Benioff. Marc Benioff, the head of Salesforce. I first met him when he was a junior guy at Oracle, probably back in 1993. He had a policy, it was called the 1-1-1 policy, and it was give 1% of profits to charity, 1% of revenues to charity, and 1% of volunteer time from your company to charity. And it may not sound like a lot, but that's a significant amount. And, I think he truly has a sense of responsibility for humanity and the planet that is sincere, not greenwashing. Last fall, the Benioff, Salesforce was the first large U.S. company to become carbon neutral in its operations, including its supply chain. So here's a guy who doesn't just talk, he walks the walk. And I think if our species is to survive and to not live in abject misery in the future, we need every goddamn business to do what Marc Benioff is doing.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that experience and what you've learned from your own interviews there. So one of the things I mentioned in your introduction is that you are a Pulitzer Prize-nominated author. Wow. So, tell me about that moment. Were you out like mowing the lawn or walking the beach in New Haven and then suddenly says, by the way, or do you have to nominate yourself or does somebody nominate? How does that work?
Yeah, well, there's actually a little bit less there than meets the eye. My publisher for my most recent book is Columbia University Press, and they submitted the book for consideration. And the book, as you mentioned before, is The Pivot, Addressing Global Problems Through Local Action. I don't expect it to win. There's a lot of great competition out there, but it is an honor to have my publisher nominated or suggested. But Columbia is a very impressive organization, and for them to think highly of it is great. I'm very pleased. The book is really a labor of love. It's really about this moment in time, it started with COVID, kind of a wake-up call to humanity that we're not living sustainably, and we have to radically change the way we're living. And I think that's the COVID is a global pandemic, which is a wake-up call, but also look at all these other things around us, the fires, the droughts, the mass migration of refugees because of climate change, the rising sea levels, and then all these other stresses that we face in the world. Clearly economic inequities are just way out of balance, not sustainable. Racism is going crazy, and it's just not sustainable. How can we human beings treat other human beings this way? And how can our society have structures and institutions that are based on racism? And it does, and it's got to stop. And then, of course, we've got politics where half the people in America seem to be motivated by hate and fear and lies. We're in a world right now that is absolutely unsustainable. This is nuts. And it's time to get going on changing it.
So this is off script, this question here, but in the midst of everything you described there, Steve, how does one still continue to live their own life with personal joy?
Well, that's a great question. I have COVID, so I'm living joyfully in spite of having COVID. But there's a temptation with all these fears around us to look away and to go into a cocoon and pretend it isn't happening. And some people might think that's the only way to be happy is if you ignore what's happening around you. But I frankly think that we have these colossal challenges all around us, and the way to live a joyful life is to be a campaigner, to be an activist, and to be one of those in the world who's gathering with others of like mind and taking these things on and frankly, saving our species. What could be more gratifying in your life than such a high calling? So I think that's the way to live joyfully. Go straight for it. Don't look away. There was a research project done recently that if you only spend 2 hours a week in nature, you're a happier person. Well, but you can't really enjoy nature with your eyes closed to the threats to it. You've got to have your eyes open.
Thanks for sharing that. And that's a great segue into your whole project in the book and your participation in the Pivot project. Why don't you tell us, give us a background. What is that all about? Whose idea was it? how did it come to be? Because when I read it and read the whole introduction and description of the formation, I'm like, how does that even get started?
Right at the beginning of COVID, March 2020, you remember those crazy times when so much was uncertain. Somebody that I know, Colin Harrison, who was a longtime research leader at IBM, but he had been, when I was there, and I was there for 6 years, the reason I went there was because they had this strategy called A Smarter Planet. And that was the idea that thanks to all these new Internet of Things sensors and all these new capabilities with data management and data analytics, that we could actually understand how the world works better, and we can, as a result, help it operate in a more efficient and effective way. So he left IBM, and so did I. He had started this new venture. They decided to call it Pivot Projects. What he said was, here we are at the beginning of COVID, and this is an opportunity to pivot. It's a wake-up call about all those things I described. We're not living sustainably. Let's do something about it. And he reached out to his global network. In order to solve big, complex problems, you need to have a diverse intelligence of humans, people with different points of view, expertise. I reached out to him. I said, can I join as an embedded journalist? You know, kind of like how journalists are embedded in warfare. It was just an amazing experience. So I met all these fantastic people, and I basically wrote this book about the journey of this group. And I figured out pretty soon along the way that the book was really about this wonderful impulse of humans to pull together at times of crisis and try to do something about it.
Wow.
So that's the core of the book. And the journey here was, hey, let's try to see what we can do about climate change, about COVID, about the world's problems. I pivoted and I said, gee, I've been this third party, objective, but now I want to get involved. So I really just dove right in. I became one of the leaders of the group. It became even a richer experience.
That's incredible. Now, a lot of us, we create daily to-do lists. Yeah. But what you're sharing is these guys and your own to-do list is like save the world. Yeah. Boy, I'm going to have to revise and pivot on my own to-do list.
Yeah. It's DYI, save the world, save the planet.
Wow.
Yeah. We have to pivot as a society to become more sustainable, and we have to pivot as communities, and we have to pivot as individuals to become climate activists. And we have to learn from others, but then figure out, well, what's the best way to use our skills and energy?
Love it. So you are now one of the leaders of it. And one of the things that you posit in the book is that technology tools, things like collaboration tools and systems thinking and visualization tools and AI, all of this will be essential for society actually making a dent on this and saving the planet. Yeah. Talk to us about your position there.
Yeah. So I think that our society, especially in the United States and Northern Europe, really developed places, we have truly entered the era of mass global collaboration. And this is enabled by these wonderful tools. Now, a lot of organizations have been using Zoom, Slack, cloud storage, cloud applications, all these kinds of things. But really, with COVID, it exploded. So all sorts of people are using this. And the Pivot Project used all those tools. Another tool that we used was Kumu. And Kumu is a data and system mapping tool that really helps you understand how systems relate to each other. We had access to artificial intelligence tool called Spark Beyond from an Israeli company. And that really is a research assistance tool that really helps people accelerate the research, or find connections that aren't obvious, find solutions that are already being tried for one thing that might be applied to another, which is one of the major things we do in science these days, certainly in medicine. Before this, you had to bring people from around the world, extremely expensive and time-consuming and almost impossible to do. Well, now we can bring together whatever sets of intelligence and expertise we need from around the world And we can operate, and we can share knowledge, and we can act, and we can move forward. Let's come together and let's act.
Oh, yeah. So when you look back kind of in hindsight and you look forward, what are some of the key deliverables that you guys were able to put together and make some progress on?
I think the big invention of the group, the discovery that I just described. We have all these incredible tools. We have collective intelligence, collective diverse intelligence with expertise on it. So I would say that the invention of pivot projects was not its own. It was not the only thing that invented this thing. It was. We came to this powerful tool, this powerful sets of tools, and that we know that this tool could be used to advise on policy. It could be used to advise, at the highest level. Members of it were parts of UN committees that submitted papers before COP26. There was a group about water. They looked at water pricing, and they said, well, right now in the world, we don't price water accurately. Big users of water and big polluters of water get it practically for free. Retail, regular people pay relatively high prices for it. So they came up with this idea of water basically for free for poor people, and then based on your ability to pay, higher, and then for businesses, relatively high rates to start with, and extremely high rates for polluters and high users. So these were some of the kinds of things that came out. I mean, another one was University in Wales, pioneers in using photovoltaic coatings as opposed to glass, as opposed to panels, solar panels. And they have this whole concept of coating buildings in developing nations and really turning like the city hall or the schools into power plants for the village, so that you can run the Wi-Fi for a whole village off of the coated municipal building and things like that. So there were all sorts of really, really, really cool ideas. In the humanities, one of the guys in the group is a recovering alcoholic, and he basically said, you can look at alcoholism, and you could look at our over-consuming society as in parallel, as very similar. And you could say, well, what's a 12-step plan? Not for addiction to drugs or alcohol, but for addiction to fossil fuels or to overconsumption of goods and services. So, I mean, there were just lots of really, really good ideas, and all those are in the book. Yeah.
So many of these projects are just massive, global in context. Now, you were able to also take some of those concepts and ideas locally to your community, weren't you?
Pivot projects took me out into the world and made me think about sustainability and resilience and learn about them in new ways. Well, let me bring it back to my community, because often we think about climate change and global warming. We think, oh my God, it's something that's happening, in the
at the macro level.
Yeah. But also it's going to have impacts locally, and people may not realize that. The projection of the worst case is like 7 feet of sea level rise. Now that puts a bunch of our neighborhoods underwater. And of course, that's with just normal sea level rise. We have hurricanes and we have high tides. So, you have a hurricane come through now and a high tide now, and you're going to have massive flooding and destruction. So this isn't something in the future. This is something now. So we've got to raise awareness among all the people in our community. Right now, in our city, we get about 3 days per year that can kill people. By the end of the century, 13, 14 days. They kill people who are elderly, and they kill babies. And a lot of poor people do not have air conditioning, or they may have it, but they can't afford to run it. So this is an issue. We're going to have climate refugees. Right now we have this whole thing in our country, and the pressures are nothing now compared to when the equatorial regions of the country can no longer support life. Food costs for everybody are going to soar, and of course for the poor it's going to be the worst. So these are real problems immediately. So we, in my town, we started a group called Reimagining New Haven in the era of climate change. And the whole idea is we have to reimagine our city. Let's do it in a positive way. Let's think about how can we make our city more sustainable and resilient in the face of climate change. But let's also, while we're doing that, hey, let's just make it a better place. We've started on this. We're planning on having a couple of design charrettes in October around this, one around awareness and priorities, one around a workshop towards solutions. And then the group really, there are lots of groups that already exist around climate change. Yeah. So we're not going to kind of create another one that's ongoing. We just want to feed this energy and these ideas into groups that can already do something about it, superpower them, that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah. In my mind, as you're describing this, I'm thinking New Haven as the new Venice, and canals, 7 feet more water. You have canals all through the city.
Manhattan, the Museum of Modern Art almost a decade ago had a special project around reimagining Manhattan. And they had all these architects and city planners and massive floating things because all through Brooklyn is very low. Parts of Manhattan are very low. They basically had these incredible visions of these large floating things, floating gardens, floating, living spaces, floating parks. It was really cool. It's really very nice.
That's awesome. And that really gets to, if we're facing this climate disaster, if you would, how do we actually not only try to stop, sustain, and reverse some of this, but in the event we can't, how do we make a positive change to be able to survive in these climates?
Yeah, part of it is, people talk about mitigation. Can we slow it down by burning fewer fossil fuels? And then there's adaptation. And adaptation includes everything from, retreating from the coastline or building up. Along the coast here, rich people are already elevating their houses several feet. And they can do that, but they put them on pilings. We use fossil fuels so heavily, even though solar and wind and other alternatives are price competitive. There are barriers to getting them into the grid. And some of these barriers are just kind of regulatory. Some of them are put there by politicians who are doing the bidding of established fossil fuel company. They are slowing down so they can maximize profits. Well, enough of that. We shouldn't be sacrificing our future and our children's and grandchildren's future to the profits of fossil fuel companies and to the greed of politicians who are doing their bidding. A positive thing, community gardens. It may sound simple. It is simple. We have in our cities, we have lots of vacant lots, unfortunately, because of urban renewal. A lot of places got knocked down. Hey, these are community gardens. And a community garden doesn't just raise vegetables. It brings people together and knits a community and makes it more powerful and resilient. So maximize community gardens. One of the big problems with America is the suburbs have very successfully fenced out poor people. Well, as part of our transformation, as part of our pivot, that's got to stop. They need to do their part to help have a more integrated and a more equitable society. And that includes homeless, and it includes people with addictions. Right now, all around my state, there are people all over the place with opioid addictions. Where are they sent to a clinic? They're sent to a city. Those suburban towns need to serve their own people. And I also think that one good way for suburbs to be integrated into our greater society is welcome the immigrant, welcome the refugee, because these are people with nothing. And all these suburbs, they've got the Lions Club, they got the Elks Club, they got the churches. They can sponsor refugees right now from Afghanistan and from other conflict places, Bring them into their communities, welcome them, learn about their culture, teach your kids around their culture and about tolerance so your kids don't grow up to be monsters, you know?
So, Steve, I was recently reading a book called The Loop by Jacob Ward. And he says research shows, and he has this whole section in the book about this, that humans are terrible at predicting the future risk and getting motivated to act on a future risk.
True.
So how do we
we're very
convince
short-term
people that there really truly is a existential risk out there, and they really should be inspired and motivated to do something about it?
You know, the example of the 1950s and 1960s in the United States, we had no environmental protections. Rachel Carson, a scientist in the U.S. Forestry Service, observed the impact of DDT on animals. DDT was used widely for killing insects in agriculture. And she did her reports and did her research, and then she wrote this fantastic book, you know, Silent Spring. And Silent Spring woke people up. Woke people up by making a tremendous argument and just being a very convincing piece of propaganda. But, you know, people think propaganda, that's lies. Well, no. This propaganda was about the truth, right? Propaganda is using techniques to convince people of things. And it could be about
propaganda
a lie
for the good. I always thought propaganda was associated with something that was false or.
I think people do think of it that way.
Okay.
But anyway, you know, we are in a period of perpetual crisis now. We've got COVID, which is perpetual. We got monkeypox coming next. We got climate change. We got hate and fear. We've got racism. We got economic inequality. We got fires. They're all happening at once, and they're ongoing. And but I think we activists raise awareness without turning people off. And you know, we're doing that with our, you know, Reimagining New Haven. It's kind of a positive thing. You know, there are kind of eco-terrorists and confrontationalists and stuff like that. And I think that's absolutely useless. I hope there's the minimum of that. I mean, I think Greta Thunberg is the example of the way to do it. And hopefully there'll be more like that. You know, people shy away from a critique of capitalism because they're afraid of being called commies or something like that. But I think the case can be made that, hey, the way it's being practiced now is really unsustainable. But we can have a better kind of form. We can use capitalism in a better way as a tool for us.
Yes.
As a tool for society to make a more equitable society, to make a more sustainable. It can be vibrant. We can use all of our creativity and our desire to build things, all those great impulses. But greed is not necessary. Maximizing profits is not necessary. And at Pivot Projects, they really came up with this idea of kind of collective, communal-based innovation being really an engine for economic growth. We humans have tremendous capacity. We have this capacity for love and care and kindness. And I think now is the moment to develop those muscles.
I love it.
And to use them together.
So, Steve, have you ever heard of the tire chain on the West Coast called Les Schwab? But the book that Les Schwab, the founder, wrote, he said every year that his profits improve or his revenue improves, he gives raises to every store manager and assistant manager. Yeah. He said he is committed to holding his own annual take from the business to the same level. Maybe he has inflation built into there. He said any improvements beyond that will go straight back to employees. And I mean, the guy was fabulously wealthy and owns most of Eastern, or did before he passed away. He owned most of Eastern Oregon anyway. He didn't need more, but he just made sure that every additional penny went straight to pay raises for his employees.
Yeah.
I loved it.
Yeah, well, that's a great example. Also, my ancestral home is a small town in southeastern Kansas,
Huh?
and my cousins still live there. And one of my cousins, there, we have a family farm, which my family is no longer an owner.
Yeah.
But there's a family farm that's been there since 1857. Our great great grandparents.
Wow.
But one of my cousins left the farm and started a trailer hitch company. He invented a trailer hitch. Well,
Yeah.
that trailer hitch company employs 700 people in that town.
Oh,
Is probably one of the largest manufacturing companies in Kansas. And he, a bunch of years ago, decided to give back. And the center of the town, which is beautiful, had been hollowed out by, automation of farming, by Walmarts on two ends of town, by
yeah.
all those things in modern life. So he's been buying up property and they're redeveloping it. And then they also bring in colleagues and they're basically turning this town into just an idyllic place. Now, the weather is still pretty hot. They haven't been able to change the weather. They have really turned this into a vibrant, wonderful community. And it's just a sign of when, this is really both what you described and what I'm describing is a sign of a benevolent, wealthy person.
Mm.
Now, not every town gets to have one.
Yes.
So it's not sustainable, but it shows you what can happen if people have the right attitude. So,
if priorities change. Steve, I want to thank you so much for coming to us even with COVID. I'm so sorry, man.
Yeah, no problem. And by the way, we talked about my title is Chief Storyteller. I'm a storyteller. But you know what I want to be? I want to be a futurist. You have inspired me because I want to be not a dystopian futurist, but I want to be a positive futurist.
Well, yeah, because if you can project forward and you can look at what's possible, plausible, and probable, and you can see a lot of bad future events that are possible, you really want to pick and choose and say, guys, if we're going to get the positive future vision here, we've got a lot of work to do and we have to do it together.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right.
Steve,
so what a pleasure talking to you, sir. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve.